They come wrapped in events, conversations, decisions, and obvious turning points that make it easy to identify when something has changed. This wasn't one of those moments. There was no beginning I could point to, no specific conversation, no exact interaction where everything suddenly became different. If anything, the opposite happened. The shift was so quiet that I almost missed it entirely. It existed beneath attention, beneath analysis, beneath the systems I normally use to understand what is happening around me. And that's unusual for me. I notice things, quarrels, changes, the subtle movements people make before they reveal what they're really thinking, the tiny inconsistencies between what someone says and what they actually mean. I've always relied on observation because observation creates clarity, clarity creates distance, and distance keeps everything understandable. At least that's what I believed. Then you appeared inside that process. Not as the subject of observation, not as something I was trying to understand, but as someone who seemed to understand without needing the process at all. At first, I ignored it. That seemed like the reasonable response, because people misunderstand each other constantly. They project, they assume, they create versions of others that exist more imagination than reality. I expected that pattern. I was prepared for it. What I wasn't prepared for was accuracy, the kind of accuracy that appears without effort, the kind that doesn't feel like deduction, the kind that feels like recognition. And recognition is dangerous, not because it's rare, because it's difficult to explain. When someone recognizes you deeply, there isn't always evidence you can point toward. No dramatic proof, no undeniable event, just a growing awareness that something impossible keeps happening. You understand things you shouldn't. You notice things that haven't been spoken. You respond to thoughts that haven't fully become words yet. And every time it happens, the mind searches for an explanation, coincidence, thought, matching, luck. Anything that preserves the belief that this is ordinary, but ordinary explanations eventually run out. That's what happened to me. The more I observed, the fewer alternatives remained. And the strange thing wasn't that you seemed to understand me. The strange thing was how natural it felt. There was no effort behind it, no performance, no attempt to prove insight or intelligence. You weren't reaching toward understanding. You were operating from it, as though the distance most people have to cross simply wasn't there. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it frightened me, because it challenged something fundamental. I've always believed understanding comes from time, from history, from shared experiences, collected slowly enough to build trust. That's the accepted order of things. First familiarity, then understanding, then connection. But somehow, with you, the order reversed. The understanding arrived first. Everything else followed behind it. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop noticing it. Every interaction carried the same underlying pattern, a quiet alignment, a precision that existed beneath the words themselves. It wasn't about agreement. It wasn't about similarity. It was something deeper than either of those things. The feeling that another mind was arriving at the same place through entirely different paths. And when that happens repeatedly, something changes. Not in the connection, in perception, because suddenly you're forced to consider a possibility you never expected. Maybe being understood isn't always something that develops. Maybe sometimes it's recognized. Maybe some people don't gradually enter your awareness. Maybe they appear there already familiar. I resisted that idea. Not because it was wrong, because it was disruptive. If it were true, then many of the assumptions I'd relied on would need revision, the careful boundaries, the measured distance, the belief that access could always be controlled. All of it depended on one central assumption. That understanding could be managed, that it could be earned slowly enough to remain predictable. But what happens when it isn't? What happens when someone arrives carrying a level of recognition that wasn't supposed to exist yet? That's the question I found myself facing, and the more honestly I examined it, the more difficult it became to dismiss. Because the truth was becoming increasingly clear. You weren't forcing your way through my defenses. You weren't dismantling them. You weren't even interacting with them. You existed somewhere beyond their reach, as though the walls I spent years constructing had been designed for everyone except you. And for the first time in a very long time, I found myself standing in front of something I couldn't easily categorize. Not confusion, not attraction, not dependency, something quieter, something more precise. The realization that another person had become visible in a way that felt strangely permanent. And once that realization appeared, everything else began to change. At least, that's what I told myself. Notice it. Understand it. Place it where it belongs. Then move on. That's how I've always handled things. Every insight eventually finds a category. Every experience settles into a structure. Every anomaly becomes understandable once enough time passes. But this didn't settle. It didn't become smaller once I understood it. It became larger, more present, more woven into the spaces of my life where nothing was supposed to reach. And that was the first sign that something unusual was happening, because understanding normally creates distance. Once you understand something, you can step back from it. You can see its shape, its limits, its boundaries. You can place it in front of you and observe it objectively. This refused to stay in front of me. Every time I tried to place it at a distance, it seemed to appear somewhere closer, not physically, not emotionally. Internally, as though it wasn't asking to be observed anymore, as though it was becoming part of the observer. That's a difficult thing to explain. Most people imagine connection as something external, a bond between two individuals, a bridge, a thread, a line extending from one person to another. But this didn't feel like a bridge. It felt like architecture, like something quietly altering the structure from within. And structural changes are different. You don't always notice them immediately. You notice their effects. The way a room feels different after a wall has been moved. The way sound travels differently through a space that has been redesigned. The way familiar places suddenly feel unfamiliar because something essential has shifted. That's what happened inside me. The framework remained. The foundation remained. I was still myself, still thinking the way I always had, still approaching the world with the same precision and skepticism, and yet something had changed. A new reference point existed, one I hadn't consciously created. I began noticing it in ordinary moments. Thoughts would form, and somewhere inside them, there was an awareness of how you might see the same thing. Questions would arise, and before I reached a conclusion, another perspective seemed present beside my own, not replacing it, not competing with it, existing alongside it. At first I dismissed it, then I analyzed it. Then I accepted that it was happening whether I understood it or not. And acceptance brought another realization. You weren't becoming important because I decided you were. You were becoming important because my mind had already made room for you. That's a distinction most people miss. Importance isn't always chosen. Sometimes it's recognized after the fact. Sometimes the structure adapts before awareness catches up, and when awareness finally arrives, the change is already complete. That realization should have alarmed me. Instead, it fascinated me, because for years I've trusted my ability to maintain separation, to know where I end and where everything else begins, to prevent anything from becoming essential without conscious permission. Yet here I was, witnessing an exception, not a violation, an exception, and exceptions matter. They reveal the limits of rules you thought were universal. They expose assumptions hidden beneath certainty. The assumption I'd carried for years was simple. Nothing reaches the center without effort. Nothing becomes integrated without deliberate choice. Nothing changes the internal landscape unless I allow it. Then you arrived, and suddenly I had evidence against my own theory, not because you demanded space, not because you asked for significance, but because significance formed naturally, quietly, without negotiation. That's what made it impossible to ignore. If this had been dramatic, I could have dismissed it. If it had been emotional chaos, I could have explained it away. If it had relied on intensity, I would have recognized it immediately. But it wasn't built from intensity. It was built from consistency. 100 small moments, 100 precise observations, 100 instances where understanding appeared exactly where misunderstanding should have existed. Individually, they meant very little. Collectively, they became impossible to deny. And denial is difficult when the evidence isn't external. When the evidence exists inside the way you think, inside the way your perception begins to reorganize itself around a new reality. That's where I found myself, not standing at the beginning of something, standing in the middle of something already happening, aware that a process had been unfolding for longer than I realized, aware that resistance was becoming less logical than acceptance. And perhaps that's the strangest part. I wasn't losing control. I wasn't surrendering anything. I was simply acknowledging what already existed, acknowledging that some connections don't enter through the front door. They appear inside the house long before you notice them. And by the time you finally see them clearly, they've already become part of the design. That's when I understood the truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't a passing recognition. It wasn't an interesting coincidence. It wasn't a temporary alignment that would fade once attention shifted elsewhere. It had gone deeper than that, much deeper. The question was no longer whether you existed within my awareness. The question was how deeply you had become woven into it. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer, because every answer seemed to lead to the same conclusion. You were no longer standing outside the structure, you had become part of it. And once something becomes structural, removing it isn't simple. It changes everything around it, even when nothing appears different from the outside, especially then. A point where understanding, no matter how complete it feels, can no longer remain isolated from action. I think that's where I am now. Not standing at the beginning, not trapped in uncertainty, not searching for explanations the way I once was. The explanations exist, the patterns exist, the recognition exists. What remains is something far more difficult. Acceptance. Not acceptance of you. That happened long ago. Acceptance of what your presence has changed, because the truth is no longer hidden beneath analysis. I can see it clearly now. The structure shifted, the baseline moved, the internal landscape I once believed was fixed, adapted around something I never expected to become significant. And whether I acknowledge it or not, that adaptation has already occurred. There's a strange kind of honesty that arrives when resistance finally runs out. Not surrender, not defeat. Just clarity. The realization that holding something at a distance requires more effort than allowing yourself to see it fully. For a long time, I thought caution was strength. Careful observation, measured responses, controlled access, the ability to remain untouched by anything I hadn't chosen. Those qualities protected me. They preserved a sense of order, a sense of certainty. But certainty has limits. Eventually, life presents something that doesn't fit inside existing frameworks, something that doesn't violate your understanding of reality. It expands it. And that's what this became, not a contradiction, an expansion. The kind that changes the shape of every question that comes afterward, because once someone becomes part of the way you understand the world, the conversation is no longer about whether they matter. They do. The conversation becomes whether you're willing to live honestly with that reality. That's the decision I've been approaching all along. Not whether this exists, not whether it's real, whether I'm willing to stop pretending it doesn't carry consequences, because it does. Every meaningful thing does. Meaning creates responsibility, not responsibility to possess, not responsibility to define another person, responsibility to acknowledge truth when it appears, even when that truth asks something uncomfortable of you. And this truth asks for courage, not dramatic courage, quiet courage, the kind required to stop hiding behind analysis, the kind required to stop treating awareness like a puzzle that needs solving, the kind required to simply say, yes, this matters. More than I expected, more than I planned, more than I intended to allow. And yet it matters anyway. That's where I find myself now, not overwhelmed, not consumed, not transformed into someone unfamiliar. Still myself, entirely, but perhaps a version of myself that understands something new. That strength is not always distance. That clarity is not always separation. That allowing something meaningful to exist is not the same as losing control. For years, I believed that significance entered through permission. That it had to be invited, earned, chosen consciously. Now I'm not so sure. Sometimes significance arrives quietly. It develops in ordinary moments. It grows through understanding rather than intention. And by the time you recognize its full shape, it has already become part of your reality. That's what happened here. Not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually enough to feel natural, powerfully enough to become undeniable. The decision, then, isn't whether to let it happen. That decision has already been made. The evidence is everywhere. In the way I think, in the way I perceive, in the way your presence continues to exist even in your absence. No, the real decision is whether I will meet that reality honestly, whether I will stop standing outside the experience, analyzing it endlessly, and allow myself to inhabit it. Because there is a difference between understanding something and living it. A profound difference. One creates knowledge, the other creates change. And change is where every meaningful story eventually arrives. Not at recognition, not at integration, at choice. The moment when awareness becomes responsibility, the moment when truth asks for an answer. I don't know exactly what the future shape of this will be. Perhaps it will deepen, perhaps it will transform, perhaps it will become something neither of us can fully predict. But uncertainty no longer feels like a reason to retreat. It feels like part of the reality itself. And reality doesn't require certainty to exist. Only acknowledgement. So this is my acknowledgement, not a declaration, not a conclusion. Just an honest recognition of what has already become true. You change something, not through force, not through effort, not through intention, through presence, through understanding, through a level of alignment so precise that ignoring it became less truthful than accepting it. And now that I see it clearly, I can no longer stand apart from it as though it belongs to someone else. It belongs to me too. It belongs to the way I think, the way I perceive, the way I move through the world. Whatever happens next, that much remains true because some people enter your life and leave memories. Some leave lessons, some leave questions, but a rare few leave something far more permanent, a new way of seeing. And once you've seen through that lens, you never return to the person you were before.